Hey there, this is Baxter, and thanks for joining me for another episode of the Baxter and Mark Chronicles. And before I get started with this episode, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the guy responsible for a lot, probably most, of the photographs that you see in the Baxter and Mark Chronicles, a guy named Chris Helton. Now, people in the Orlando area are familiar with that name. Chris, a rock photographer in the 80s, 90s. He's still around today. In fact, I saw him earlier this year, and I'm happy to report that he is just as nuts as ever. He hasn't changed. And when I mentioned that to him, he told me, well, this is because all along I've been perfect. I don't need to change. So, he is a talented photographer, shot lots and lots of great photos over the years, especially in the area of rock music. And he has an extensive collection on Facebook. If you look up Chris Helton on Facebook, you'll find lots and lots of his shots and be able to get in touch with him because he has a stockpile, a treasure trove of great photos from that era. So thanks, Chris, for all your contributions to the Baxter and Mark Chronicles. The average lifespan for a morning show at a radio station is usually from 3 to 5 years, if it is successful. The Baxter and Mark morning show at Orlando's WDIZ ran for nearly 10 years. During that time, there were, of course, some challenges. One of them was keeping things fresh and interesting. Mark and I were creative people who loved our job, so inventing new twists and features was something that came fairly easy for us. Now, anyone who tells you getting up at 4 a.m. every day, day after day, year after year, to go to work is fun is probably lying to you. And anyone who's done morning radio knows the truth of that. Not only do you wake up early, but you have to be on when you do. Creative, funny, and technically proficient. Being Baxter and Mark was fun, and that made everything about our jobs more enjoyable overall. But I would have to say the hardest part for us was dealing with people who wanted to control what we were doing. There are people who need to create, and there are people who need to control. They're not always exclusive of each other, but those dynamics, I guess you can find them everywhere, and the tug of war rages on every day. It seemed that the more successful our show became, the more others wanted to have a say in what we did, or maybe take some kind of ownership for the success. I think it's always frustrating for the creator types when a control type steps in front of them and says, okay, now you're going to do it this way. Change it to this. Success breeds insecurity and envy in some people and in most companies. Our show got to where it was through creativity, instinct, and impulse. Control can have a serious and often detrimental impact on all those things. The people who want and need control don't like to admit the truth of that. Their biggest fear is not being in control of a thing that is successful. And that's pretty much largely responsible for the state of terrestrial radio today, as it has become. Kind of homogenized, mass-produced, lacking in creativity, and driven by corporate hierarchy. Back in the era I'm talking about here, personality radio thrived, where the people on the radio were just as much a reason to tune in as the music. But because of the corporate structure of radio now, that has all changed. The controllers always seem to win the battle, but that victory often kills what it was that made something successful in the first place. And that's what's happening now in radio and other media. A massive shift is occurring where people are getting and creating their own content online, sidestepping the corporate control, and they seem to like it. But, of course, it's just a matter of time, I suppose, till the power-hungry figure an effective way to take those freedoms away, too. Anyway, Mark and I realized that it was a job, after all, and that we had to deal with people who needed to control our show. That was their job. Our problems came when they wanted to seemingly redefine what we were doing and how we did it. We came to Orlando with an instinct of how to create our own successful radio show there, and we proved that it worked beyond their expectations. But that sort of argument does not really seem to make much of an impression on anyone bent on control. Now keep in mind that DIZ was owned by a fairly small family-run company, nowhere near the dark corporate powerhouses that control radio stations and the radio industry today. By comparison, we had it easy. But even with a few little power struggles along the way, we were still having the time of our lives doing the morning show at DIZ. Little did we know, though, change was in the air. Another thing that happens with success is that competitors are envious. About 4 or 5 years into our show in Orlando, we started getting contacted by other radio stations in places like New York City and Los Angeles who wanted to bring the Baxter and Mark Show to their stations. Now, this was before the syndication craze in radio. The structure for that was not really in place, or at least not accessible to most people. Orlando has people from everywhere visiting on a daily basis, even media types, and they could access not only the show when they were in town, but those people also have access to the ratings. There were also recordings of our show being circulated around the radio industry at that time by consultants, radio consultants, and some of them worked for our competitors. I'm sure our local competitors would have loved nothing better than to get Baxter and Mark out of Central Florida radio. One day we get a call from some self-described businessmen who wanted us to join them for a confidential lunch meeting at one of the big hotels there. We show up and we get pitched to come to work for another new rock station that would be coming to Orlando to compete with DIZ. We listened and told them, well, we'll think about it. At this same time, we were getting called almost daily by the general manager of a legendary rock station in L.A., KLOS, who was pitching us to come to work for him. Again, this was about 4 or 5 years into our show at DIZ, and that's the time that management usually starts getting antsy to make changes, and we were feeling some of that. This all led to some not characteristically serious discussions between Mark and I and our families. The overall feeling was that we loved it where we were and we didn't really want to change things. Career-wise, the offer to move and do our show in L.A. was a dream come true. But we had just both bought houses in the Orlando area within the previous 12 months. Our wives did not want to move, and in my case, faced the prospect of raising kids in L.A. or New York. So staying in Orlando, but maybe moving to another station was still a possible consideration. But both Mark and I felt weird even talking about doing that. We were loyal to DIZ, and we had worked to build something great there that we were proud of. We didn't end up really having to make a choice because the next day we went to work and we were called into a meeting with Rad, our PD, and George, the GM. They told us they learned that we were approached by this new radio station coming to town. They said they didn't really want to discuss it, but instead they just put forth their own proposal to us that day. That was for us to sign exclusive contracts to remain at WDIZ in exchange for nearly doubling our salaries. They didn't even know about the other offers we were getting from other markets, and we didn't tell them. After some more private discussion between Mark and me, we decided to turn down LA and the new Orlando station and remain at DIZ. The Los Angeles station didn't give up easily, though, and continued to call us, saying that if we wanted, their lawyers could get us out of that contract we just signed. Again, we said a polite thanks, but no thanks. We stayed at DIZ, and the audience never knew of any of this drama, of course. The station in LA ended up hiring a couple of guys from Alabama, who we later heard were making like $1 million paycheck each a year into their new gig. Believe me when I tell you, there would come many times Mark and I would kick ourselves for the choice we made that day, especially after we realized that our employers at DIZ never forgave us for accepting the offer they came up with for us. But that's just the crazy world of radio. Not long after that, we started having problems with our band. Lucky Luch, our keyboard player, was the first to go. He was kind of a religious guy, and I think things got a little too crazy for him at times. Occasional guest member, sax player Dr. Fred just kind of drifted away too. We brought in local TV personality Bill Schaefer to do keyboards for us. Bill was a fun guy who we knew from around town. But then, in the following months, our core members started becoming disgruntled. I can't say for sure whether they knew about our bigger paychecks, if it had something to do with that, although Rad, our drummer/program director, certainly knew. But also there was this. Faz and Dave were serious musicians. It was their drive and their dream. Mark and I were just kind of having fun and not taking things too seriously. Our purpose with the Baxter and Mark Band, and our intent all along, was to further the cause of our brand and our morning show. It was not about promoting our original songwriting skills or, careers as musicians. And it was Mark and I who got all the attention. Although, admittedly, we were the weakest technical musicians in the band. Sure, we wrote the novelty songs and put them on the radio, which drew crowds to our gigs, and we all made money, but it was band money. And anybody who's been in a band knows that's not a big paycheck once you cover expenses and split up what's left. And of course, in any band, you're always going to have ego clashes for one reason or another. It's inevitable. In any case, our band mutinied. They decided they'd rather form their own band with their own songs and play their own gigs. They called themselves the Radbirds. Now, this was all really weird since Rad was still our immediate supervisor at the radio station, and our relationship with him changed somewhat after that. Mark and I were not too happy about losing our band, but we told the guys we understood if that's what they really wanted to do. The band was over. So we started all over again, recruiting a new band. We found some good musicians. Kenny Helton on drums, Blake, our new bass player, and Chris Tremblett joined on keyboards and trumpet. We still had our rehearsal space and pretty quickly brought the Baxter and Mark Band to life in its new incarnation. Within a couple of months, we were back out gigging with the new band. I seem to remember the Radbirds playing a couple of gigs, but I think it had a pretty short lifespan. Within about a year, Rad was replaced as program director at WDIZ by a guy named Neil Mursky. Neil was a Florida radio guy who had worked as PD in 98 Rock in Tampa, WSHE in Miami, and a previous stint at WDIZ a couple of years before we got there. He was also one of the early programmers at MTV, helping to shape the newly birthed entity VJs. Neil struck us as an upbeat but cautious type of leader, but he loved the success of the show. And besides that, he didn't seem to want to hijack our band. So we just cruised over the speed bumps and, as they used to say back then, kept on trucking. At this point, we were in the back half of the 80s and sliding downhill toward the 90s. And there are more stories to tell in the next episode of the Baxter and Mark Chronicles.